So today I'm with David Gleave, who's a master of wine, who's come out from England, who is a man of many parts, who owns, or did own, Liberty Wines, one of the great distributors of wine and importers of wine based in London. A great supporter of Australian wines. I've judged wine with you, David. I've run into you here and there all around the world. These days you're not an owner of Liberty Wines anymore, are you? You're still involved, aren't you?
I'm a consultant. I'm sort of chair of the board, and I still feel very attached to it because it's we started it 28 years ago.
Okay. But what we're here to talk about today is Willunga 100, which is your Australian winery.
It is.
Which you started with a partner, I think, but now it's just you, isn't it?
No, we started, Liberty Wines sort of started it in 2005, but it was started with John Ratcliffe. When Liberty Wines was sold in 2019, John and I bought Willunga 100 out of the company because at the same time we'd bought a vineyard in Blewett Springs, and that gave us a home for the wines. And really, before Willunga 100 had been much more of an export brand, and we wanted to give it a home and sort of transform it in a way into being more of a Grenache focused and largely single vineyard producer of Grenaches from Blewett Springs in Clarendon.
Yep. So the high country of McLaren Vale.
The high country, the sandy country, and the slightly cooler country.
Yeah. What is it about Grenache that fascinates you so much?
I think it's a good question. I've always liked Grenache, and when we were starting Willunga 100, it was only going to be a Shiraz and a Cab Shiraz, and then we went looking at these vineyards and kept saying, well, what are those old bush train vines over there? And so, the guy we were with said, well, that's Grenache, mate. No one wants that. So we decided to make a Grenache that first year, and I loved the way Grenache, it was an underdog. Yes. And perhaps that's what attracted me to Italian wines all those years ago as well, sort of going slightly against the trend. And I think, if you go back, Grenache, of course, was the most widely planted grape variety in Australia in the 1960s. And then with the death of fortified wines, Grenache followed suit. But there's wonderful old vineyards, and I think Grenache, when treated properly, is a really exciting grape variety. And we've seen that happen around the world over the last couple of decades.
Do you think that Grenache is actually catching on with the public, or is it? I often wonder when these trends begin, whether, if we can call it a trend, it's always been there, but now it's having its day in the sun, and I think Grenache is now more sought after than Shiraz and has a higher price per tonne of grapes in McLaren Vale than even a Shiraz does. Is this a winemaker-driven fascination, or is it actually the market that's calling for it?
I think it's the winemakers have discovered that there's a limited amount of good old Grenache, and we're looking for good tannins, but we're not extracting a lot. There's a gentle infusion here. The tannins are there in the skins, and I think they help us to me, when you get the right tannins in the wine, they help to define the varietal character together with the acid. If you don't have it, you end up with a sort of fleshy little puppy.
And old vines seem to produce wines with more tannin and better tannin, that seems to me.
Yeah, and I think, and also some of these soils as well, because the berries are quite small, and especially the sandy soils, the water does tend to go through. We're lucky, there's usually a bit of clay, a metre or so down that the roots can go into, but the vine's not going to get a huge drink from that, so the berries remain quite small, which gives you that lovely tannin, and yes, as you say, the old vines sort of specialise in that. And
you're specialising in single vineyard Grenaches too, so just walk us through these if you would. You've got the generic Grenache to start with.
Yeah, well, it is from our own vineyard. It's all from 50 to 60-year-old vines, grown on about 4 different parcels on our sort of 19-hectare, what will be again our 19-hectare vineyard once it's back in full production. So, it's all Blewett Springs, it's all sandy soil. This is where we sort of, there's one spot on the vineyard in our sort of 15-acre block, which we get about 4,500 bottles a year. We first made in 23, so this is the first vintage. And that's Blewett Springs, but slightly lower than Trott, about 170 metres above sea level. And it's really it's like walking on the beach. It's maslin sand, white maslin sand, with a meter of white maslin sand with clay underneath. Trot over here is only about 4 minutes away.
This is Blind Spot.
That's Blind Spot, yeah. Trot is 4 minutes away from Blind Spot. But already here you've got a bit of ironstone underneath. You've got maslin sand mixed with ironstone, so it's slightly darker sand. And it changes the nature of the tannins very much. And then Smart is up in Clarendon.
That's the highest, isn't it?
Yes, but it's only about 10 meters higher than Trot. The real defining influence on this vineyard is the sort of breezes coming down from the Mount Lofty ranges. So you're closer to the Adelaide Hills here, you know, and that I think gives a much cooler site. It's also south-facing, but this year, for instance, 2025, that's going to be Smart is going to be picked 2 weeks later than Trot and Blind Spot.
Wow. So they don't go into wood at all,
No.
or some old wood?
No.
Nothing at all in the 23s.
So that's the only difference then is the site. There's no winemaking sort of artifice in there to sort of change.
No ceramic eggs or anything?
Not yet.
Not yet.
No, yeah.
Working on it.
Yeah. They're quite expensive.
And if you don't need them, why buy them?
Yeah, no, I think we will definitely go down that route. So ceramic or some concrete. As well.
Seems to be a bit of a movement.
Yeah.
There's got to be something behind it. So before we go on to the Shiraz, let's look at this. I'm dying to have a taste of this, and we've got a cooling bag on it just to bring the temperature down a degree or two. It's your wine, you pour it, David.
Thank you very much. So when we bought our vineyard in 2019, it was a grower's vineyard, and they had Chardonnay, Merlot, a little bit of Cabernet Franc. So we grubbed up some of those vineyards and planted some more Grenache with cuttings from Smart. Now that's quite young Grenache at the moment, so we're using that for our rosé. But we've also planted some southern sort of French, northern Spanish white varieties: Grenache Blanc, Grenache Gris, Picpoul, Claret, and Roussanne. And we haven't started producing it. We'll start producing some of that from 2026. And what we wanted to do was just experiment a bit with white grape varieties and see how they were going to perform in the Vale. So we bought a small amount of fruit last year from Sue Trott of the Trott Vineyard. And it's fairly young vines, but we're pretty happy with the way it came out. What I've always liked about Grenache Blanc is the texture. It's a real textural wine rather than sort of one that leaps out of the glass. But I find that some of the southern French and northern Spanish ones can get a little bit oily as well. They sort of lose their freshness. So I think what we've done here, we've got about 25% fermentation in used oak puncheons and 75% in stainless steel, and bottled quite young. So it's kept that vibrancy to it. But I think we've got the texture, and it's got pretty good intensity for a wine from young vines as well.
Yeah, a bit of seasoned barrel seems to work very well with Grenache Blanc, I think. In fact, most of those southern Rhone or / Mediterranean varieties do build that texture a bit more with a bit of barrel.
A bit of barrel and a bit of time on knees.
Well, shall we try a few more?
Yes.
Why not?
On to Grenache.
These are all 23s.
All 23s. The white was 24.
24 is the white.
All the others are 23.
And 23 was not an easy vintage, was it, in McLaren Vale?
It was quite sort of cool. It was a wet spring, so yields were relatively, it was wet and windy at flowering. And it kept raining up till sort of, just before Christmas, really. And there was lots of pressure, disease pressure, but it never got really hot. There weren't any spikes of heat. So I think that it was a long and fairly sort of gentle year in that way, once with the benefit of hindsight, of course.
Grenache is a late ripening variety, and you're in the highest and coolest part.
No, because the weather was decent enough, and the crops were quite small. We had bigger crops on Shiraz, so the smaller crops helped compensate for the poor start to the year. But it's a sort of, whereas the 22s, I really like the 22s, they're much more structured wines. The 23s have a ready to drink character, and without sacrificing their sort of, they don't perhaps have the intensity or power of the 22s, but they still have nice structure and a drinkability.
Well, certainly plenty of tannin in this wine.
Yeah.
It's the complete thing, but it's quite spicy, isn't it? That's another hallmark of the grape. It's there's pepper, but there's a different range of spices than Shiraz.
Yeah. It's got that lovely sort of red fruit character. There's almost a floral character to it as well in 23. And this is, again, we're very prudent, as they say in Scotland, about the use of oak. This has 60% of the blend is aged in oak, again, used puncheons, and 40% goes into stainless steel.
Oh, so this one does see barrel.
This one does see barrel. The three single vineyards don't. It seems to work well with that. And it's also got about 15% whole bunch.
Okay.
So again, that helps give you a sort of slightly grainy tannin, I think, and just lifts the aromatics a bit. But we don't want too much of that whole bunch character. It's a bit like, I think, a spice in food. If you get it right, you hardly notice it.
If it sticks out like stalks, like smelling stalks coming out of the end of a crusher, it's terrible.
It's some people like it, but I don't really.
Sure.
Yeah.
That's lovely wine. What is the price of that?
About $30.
$30. Well, that's very affordable.
And it's like 50 to 60-year-old vine, so it's got. I think that's if we felt that if we use the the young Grenache we've got, we'd end up with that sort of juby fruity character, which Grenache can be a bit too sort of vigorous as a young vine or adolescent, so it needs time to settle down.
While we're doing this, can you give us a comment on the English market? Because Aussies, we a lot of us who are old enough to remember the glory days of the 1980s and 90s.
Yeah.
The wheels appear to have fallen off a bit, but I hear conflicting reports. Some people say good Aussie wine is still selling well, but it's not in the shops as much as it was. It's more direct selling.
I think it's a tough market. I mean, as everywhere in the world, consumption is declining, and the market's becoming quite polarized. You could say that the supermarkets, were fantastic agents for democratizing wine in the sort of 70s and 80s and 90s, and Australia, particularly from the late 80s on, rode that boom. When I first came into the wine business in the early 80s, per capita consumption in the UK was about 9 litres per head. It did go up to 26. It's now down to about 22, 23. So, sort of rumours of the death of the wine industry are slightly exaggerated.
Premature.
And I think, but it's difficult. And I think there is so much good wine being made across the world now. That if I look at our tasting room and stuff comes through, it's more a matter of style than quality.
Yes.
So it's a really competitive market. And Australia has changed, to my mind, for the better. When I first came here in the early 90s, there were probably about sort of 900 different producers. Today there's closer to 3,000.
And when you're selecting wine to import, you probably had to throw out a lot of it, but now it's all pretty good, isn't it?
It's amazing. And I think Australian wine has never been better and never more diverse, in my view. That message is not getting across well enough in the UK. There's still a perception amongst a lot of the buyers that Australian wines are, over-oaked, overripe,
too alcoholic,
and all that sort of stuff, which we know, if you follow Australian wine closely, we know that's not the case. Of course there are wines like that, but there are wines like that from everywhere in the world.
Yes.
So I think we've got a lot of work to do, and that work, frankly, is now down to the producers.
Well, you can see immediately that's got another dimension on the nose, hasn't it? There's a really rich, smoky, spicy, sort of burnt spice character. Lovely.
Yeah. I think that
earthiness, graphite-y, sort of minerally. Yeah, fascinating.
it's almost got that sort of slight touch of coal tar I've noticed today on it, you know, which you puts me in mind sometimes of Shiraz, but you know, there's no Shiraz whatsoever in here.
Yeah.
But it's slightly lower, those deep sands with no ironstone. Somehow, you still get nice tannins. I like the sort of the crunchy tannins on that.
I think people who are used to buying sort of lower to mid-market Grenache, when they come across something like this, they say, surely that's not Grenache. There must be something else in it. Because Grenache has got a reputation as being a lighter wine, lighter colour, nothing light about that. It's sort of the Pinot Noir of the Barossa, they used to call it, there. But serious old vine Grenache from low-yielding vines and made by serious winemakers is a full-body wine.
It can be, according to the site. And this site, you know, gives more of that weight, that flesh, than, say, the Smart site. And you're right, it's serious. I mean, you know, a lot of this is down. We bought this vineyard in 2019, and it's taken us sort of, you know, 5 vintages before we, you know, felt we were getting the fruit we wanted to.
Was going into that.
Yeah.
Why is it called Blind Spot?
It's a great friend of mine sort of used to say to me that, you know, I had a blind spot about wine production in Grenache. I looked at wine production as an importer did rather than as a producer should. So he said you had a blind spot. So when I bought the vineyard, I sort of had that in mind. And it's always to remind me that I am a producer rather than an importer, distributor.
And perhaps to prove to people you don't have a blind spot.
Indeed.
So that's the Blind Spot. This is the Smart?
This is the Smart. So the Blind Spot was planted in 1968 by the De Fabio family, who bought the house from they were Italian immigrants who bought the house from the son of the man who cleared that area, the Moritz family, Lon Moritz. The Smart vineyard, this comes off of, the Smart's quite a famous vineyard up in Clarendon. They supply fruit to various different wine producers, and there's sort of 3 parts to 3 vineyards on their farm. The original one, planted in 1922, which is about 1 hectare in size. And we get half of that, together with Ministry of Clouds. Then there's one from the early 50s, where people like Steve Pannell takes fruit from. And then there's one from more the late 90s. And the fruits, they're very good farmers. But it's a very, as we talked earlier before, the Clarendon is a cooler site. So you get, you get this more sort of slightly ethereal style of Grenache.
Slightly lighter in colour.
Yeah. But if you go across the road, I mean, just the Brooks Road there, the other side is the Higginbotham vineyard, where the Angara make a very good Grenache. And that's north facing, so a bit warmer, and gives more power as well to the wine.
There's a dried herb character there as well.
Yeah. We get 10% whole bunch on this. That's the only one that gets any of the single vineyards that gets whole bunch.
Yeah, well, that sort of almost puts those together into a complete package, really. I mean, nothing against those, but that's sort of...
It's got beautiful...
I'm able to say that's fantastic right now, but it's going to be fantastic for a long time.
It fleshes out. It gives more flesh on the palate. I think it's a great, I think, trot for us. And sometimes we go back and forth about which is the best. But I think the 23 trot is outstanding.
One of these won a trophy late last year.
The Smart won the Grenache trophy at the Melbourne Wine Show.
The 23.
23, which we were delighted with.
That's interesting. Was the trot also in the show?
Yeah. The trot, there's a funny story. We talked about Grenache being the most widely planted grape variety in Australia in the 60s. By 2017, I think it was 2017, the 2015 wine we made from the Trot Vineyard won several trophies that year, and it won a trophy at the National Show in Canberra in the alternative varietals class.
Where it was thrown in with all the rats and mice.
There was no Grenache class. So a few years later, when the 21 Smart was entered in the show, it won the Grenache trophy there. There was very few people who held on to Grenache during in the 70s and 80s, and a lot of them took the the old the vine pull, the money for the wine pull scheme to rip out old vineyards, which is sad, but there's still some good old vines there, and I think we need to sort of. We're living in much easier times than those old farmers would have lived in, and to keep those vines in the ground took a huge amount of whatever it is, courage, stubbornness, or foresight. I think it was a degree of courage and stubbornness, I'd say.
Exactly, and when you look at some of the great winemakers of the past, like Maurice O'Shea, and he was practicing when not many people were interested in great wine, but he was making great wine.
Making single vineyard wines at a time when no one really knew what that was.
That all comes from in here.
It's amazing.
It's your own knowledge, your own drive, your own understanding of what great wine is, and I think faith that in the future someone else will understand it.
Yeah. No, they sort of led the way for many others, and as Henschke did with Mad Edelstone in 1952.
Yeah,
it's a remarkable story.
So we're on to Shiraz now.
So this is when we bought the vineyard. We had 13 rows of old Shiraz that had been planted in 1936. By Percy Moritz, and it wasn't in good shape. It had like a lot of vineyards. It wasn't the way the vineyard had been run. It was just it had Utipa as a virus, and so we made a wine off it, and it was pretty good. But we realised that you've got to do something about Utipa, so we cut back the vines and sacrificed crop for a couple of years. And then 23 was the first year when we got a crop off it again. A combination of that lower yields from the first fruit again and the cooler vintage, so you had a long growing season. I think we picked this in early April. Gave us a wine that is off sand, so you get the aromatic character, but also that cooler year gives you a bit of pepper and spice as well. Again, aged. This is aged in oak. It's 100%. Used French puncheons, but we don't want the that sort of smoky, spicy character of oak to come through here, because it's there in a supporting role for the fruit. So we think this is it's a Blewett Springs Shiraz rather than a McLaren Vale Shiraz, but I think it shows that even within McLaren Vale, there's a huge amount of diversity of style.
Yeah. Yes, if you look at the sea level vineyards with the black cracking soil, so you get that big chocolatey, fat, rich fruit, sweet. People love that sort of wine. It's a very different creature to this.
Absolutely. And Seaview gives you something different. And there's, remember back in the days that the old sort of Seaview brand, they were making fantastic Shiraz. And even Clarendon can produce a nice spicy sort of fruit. But I think Blewett Springs with that slightly more elevation, slightly cooler, and the sandy soil just. There's something, one of our Barolo producers says, he's got a vineyard which is quite sandy. And he says something about the sand is a trigger for the aromatics. We don't know why, but it just does it.
Well, it's a lovely contrast to the Grenaches. Like that massive fruit, massive tannin, coats the entire mouth with flavour and tannin. Big wine, perhaps not as big as an old-fashioned centre of McLaren Vale wine, but certainly full-bodied.
Yeah. Australia is identified quite often by Shiraz. And I think there's a story there that we have to tell, which is of the diversity of styles that can be produced by Shiraz in Australia, whether it's from Eden Valley, from what Clonakilla does up in Canberra district, from the Yarra, from Geelong, from the Barossa, Great Southern. There's just there's so many areas that can produce great Shiraz of different styles.
I think my last count, 42 regions in Australia that produce great Shiraz consistently, and they're quite different, a lot of them. Even Tasmania produces great Shiraz now in some places.
We haven't been getting out and telling the world about that style enough, and doing we're starting to do that a bit with Grenache, because it's like the old Avis adverts, when you're second best you try harder. I think the thing with Shiraz is we think that, well, we do it so well, we know we do it so well, but we've got to tell the rest of the world about that, and we need to get out and do Shiraz workshops and show the differences and talk about the differences, because you still hear people saying, I don't like Aussie Shiraz, which is...
It's like saying I don't like Chardonnay.
Well, exactly,
Ridiculous.
exactly. Yeah. It's totally ill-informed. So, there's a vacuum there which we need to fill with information.
Yeah. David Gleave, Willunga 100. Marvellous selection of new reds, especially, but also this little 2024 white Grenache. Lovely to see you, and thanks for joining us today here in Australia, your second home. Well, I put it that way.
Could even be third after.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Huon. I really enjoyed it.